Picture this. London, August 23rd, 1305. The city wakes under a grey and restless sky. Bells toll across the Thames as people pour into the streets. Merchants, beggars, nobles, and soldiers, all drawn by the same morbid promise. At Smithfield, a wooden platform has been built overnight, its beams blackened with pitch and iron hooks gleaming under the mist. The smell of burning tallow clings to the air. Today, England will make an example of its most hated enemy, William Wallace. For years, his name had been whispered across Scotland like a prayer and a curse, a man both real and mythical, who defied the might of King Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots. To the English, he was a murderer, an outlaw, a traitor. But to the Scots, he was something greater, the living spirit of resistance, the man who refused to kneel. And now, chained and dragged from the Tower of London, he is about to face his end. Eyewitnesses later described him as calm, gaunt from imprisonment, yet upright, his eyes fixed on the crowd rather than the ground. He wore nothing that might remind them of his old station, only coarse linen and the weight of his chains. Every jingle of iron echoed like a drumbeat of defiance. He had been tortured for days, interrogated, mocked. But as he was led toward the scaffold, Wallace said nothing. His silence was louder than any plea. The people, too, were silent. Many had come expecting spectacle, but few could look him in the eye. They saw not a barbarian, but a man, pale, bruised, yet unbroken. Rumours spread through the crowd that even some of Edward's men felt uneasy, that the condemned man's composure unnerved them. He looked more like a martyr than a traitor. And perhaps, deep down, they sensed it, that this execution was not justice, but vengeance. Over the past decade, England's conquest of Scotland had been brutal and relentless. Wallace's rebellion had threatened not only English power, but the very idea of English supremacy. To kill him publicly, to desecrate his body, to erase his memory, this was not merely punishment, it was a message. No man, not even a legend, could defy the crown and live. Yet history has a way of turning such punishments into beginnings. When the cart stopped at the platform, the executioner stepped forward, face covered, rope in hand. The crowd pressed closer. The man who had once led armies, who had defeated the English at Stirling Bridge, was now reduced to a spectacle for the king's justice. But in that moment, something profound shifted. Because though his body was bound, his story, his defiance, his vision of freedom was already beyond the reach of any rope. This was not merely the end of William Wallace. It was the beginning of a legend that would outlive kings, crowns, and empires. As the drums rolled and the executioner raised his hand, the city of London held its breath. Few could know that this moment, this brutal, calculated display, would echo for centuries. That the very act meant to erase his name would instead carve it into the stone of history. The crowd came to witness a death. Instead, they bore witness to immortality. Long before the scaffold and the roar of London crowds, William Wallace was no warrior, no noble, no prince born beneath the banners of power. He was a son of the lowlands, likely of minor gentry, perhaps a knight's son, perhaps not even that. In the late 13th century, Scotland was a land caught between kings, faith, and famine, a country whose very identity hung by a thread. When King Alexander III fell from his horse in 1286, leaving no heir, Scotland's fate began to unravel. Rival claimants fought for the throne, and in their desperation, they turned to England's King Edward I to arbitrate. But Edward, shrewd, ambitious, and ruthless, saw opportunity in chaos. Under the guise of restoring order, he moved his armies north, subduing castles, disarming knights, and quietly placing the Scottish crown beneath his own. By 1296, Scotland was not a kingdom, it was a conquest. Its nobles bent the knee, its clergy swore allegiance to Edward, and its people, farmers, fishermen, shepherds, were left to bear the weight of a foreign king's taxes and soldiers' cruelty. From the ashes of that humiliation, resistance began to stir, not in castles or courts, but in the hearts of men who refused to be owned. It was in this crucible that William Wallace emerged, a man of uncommon stature, both in body and spirit. Contemporary accounts describe him as towering, broad-shouldered, and fierce-eyed. But his strength was not in muscle alone, it was in conviction. Legend says he first drew his sword not for glory, but for love, after slaying an English soldier who had insulted his wife. Whether that story is truth or myth, it captures something essential about Wallace. His rebellion began not from politics, but from passion. The pure, ungovernable kind that rises when injustice cuts too deep. Wallace gathered others like him, commoners, dispossessed farmers, men with nothing left to lose. In a matter of months, his small band turned into a movement. They struck English garrisons by night, liberated villages, seized arms, and disappeared into the hills before dawn. What began as vengeance became a campaign of resistance. The English called him a bandit. The Scots called him hope, and hope, once awakened, spreads like fire. By 1297, Wallace's forces had swelled to thousands. Their weapons were crude, their armour scarce, but they had something far more dangerous, a cause worth dying for. When the English army marched north to crush this peasant uprising, few believed the Scots could stand against them. They were wrong. At Stirling Bridge, Wallace and his co-commander, Andrew de Moray, defied every expectation. They lured the English into crossing the narrow bridge, then struck with devastating precision. Thousands of English soldiers fell that day, drowned or cut down. Scotland had won its first great victory, and from that blood-soaked riverbank, a legend was born. For the first time in years, the Scottish banner flew unbroken. Wallace was named Guardian of Scotland, not a king, but something rarer. A man chosen by his people, not appointed by birth. To some, he was a hero, to others, a threat to their fragile alliances. But for England, he had become something worse than an enemy. He was an idea, and ideas are far harder to kill than men. Yet, as history would soon prove, even legends have their breaking points. The victory at Stirling Bridge in September 1297 did more than crush an English army. It shattered the illusion of English invincibility. For the first time in living memory, Scotland had struck back and won. The impossible had happened, and it bore one name, William Wallace. In the months that followed, the Scottish countryside roared with life again. Peasants who had once bowed their heads now lifted them. Villages that had been forced to house English soldiers drove them out. Smoke rose from garrisons as the occupying troops fled or fell. For a brief, blazing season, the land belonged to its people again. And at the heart of it all rode Wallace, not a king, not even crowned, but hailed as Guardian of Scotland, protector of a nation reborn. The chronicles of the time speak of his unmatched discipline, his refusal to pillage or harm the innocent, his insistence that their cause remain pure. "We fight not for vengeance," he is said to have told his men, "but for freedom and for the right to live as God made us." It was a simple creed, but it struck deeper than any sword. Wallace gave the people something Edward's gold and power could not: dignity. But even heroes must govern what they win. And governing, Wallace soon learned, was a war of its own. Scotland, though free for the moment, was a nation divided. Its nobility, many of whom had sworn loyalty to Edward, resented Wallace's authority. They saw in him not salvation, but a threat to their influence. While Wallace built alliances, reorganized the army, and planned for defence, the lords of Scotland whispered and hesitated. They feared both Edward's wrath and Wallace's rising fame. Meanwhile, across the border, the hammer of the Scots was forging his response. King Edward I, ruthless, calculating, and deeply humiliated by the loss, began raising a massive army, larger than any he had sent north before. To him, Wallace's rebellion was not merely a military inconvenience, it was a personal insult, and Edward did not forgive insults. Wallace knew this. He knew England would return not in months, but in fury. So he did what any commander must when facing a storm. He prepared. He fortified positions, trained new recruits, and sought aid from France, hoping to turn his victory into a lasting independence. For a time, it seemed possible. The Scots raided deep into northern England, burning enemy strongholds, capturing supplies, and spreading fear across the borderlands. Songs of Wallace's victories carried through taverns and markets from York to Paris. In the eyes of many, he had become a legend, a man who fought kings and lived. But legends cast long shadows, and in those shadows, envy and fear grew. Wallace's success isolated him as much as it exalted him. The nobles who had once rallied behind him began to drift away, their loyalties wavering. Some sought Edward's favour, others simply waited to see who would prevail. For Wallace, the path ahead narrowed. The dream of freedom had ignited a nation, but to sustain that flame would demand more than courage. It would demand sacrifice. As winter crept over the highlands, Wallace rode south once more, his sword glinting against the snow, his men hardened by victory yet weary of endless war. He could not have known that ahead lay the battle that would break his army and seal his fate. But for now, Scotland stood proud. For now, one man's defiance held an empire at bay, and the fire of freedom burned brighter than it ever had before. The year was 1298. The smoke of victory at Stirling had barely faded when the storm Wallace had foreseen finally broke. Edward I, the hammer of the Scots, had returned. Not with a punitive raid, not with a garrison, but with an army fit for a crusade. From London to York, his call to arms thundered through England. Tens of thousands answered. Knights, archers, cavalry the finest in Europe marched north under the cross of St. George. Supply ships shadowed them along the coast, bringing grain, arrows, and iron. This was not a campaign of conquest, it was an extermination. Edward's purpose was absolute, to crush the rebellion and erase the name of William Wallace from the earth. In the Scottish camps, word of the invasion spread like winter frost. Wallace, now guardian of Scotland, knew what was coming and knew he was outmatched. His men were brave, but poorly armed. His cavalry was almost non-existent. The nobles who might have provided reinforcements hesitated or defected. Still, he refused to yield. He understood something his enemies never would, that courage, not numbers, defines a nation. Wallace's strategy was simple and brutal. Deny the English the land itself. He ordered villages burned, crops destroyed, livestock driven into the hills. Better a scorched Scotland, he declared, than a conquered one. His plan was to starve Edward's army into retreat. For weeks, it nearly worked. The English, deep in enemy territory, found little to eat. Their supply ships were delayed by storms. Men fell ill. Desertions mounted. Even Edward, old and battle-hardened, began to doubt. He considered retreat. Then fate and betrayal intervened. Scottish nobles, eager to preserve their own estates, revealed Wallace's position near Falkirk. the English seized the opportunity. On the 22nd of July, 1298, the two forces met. It was not a battle of equals, it was a slaughter. Wallace arranged his troops in defensive circles of spearmen, the schiltrons, bristling like iron hedgehogs. It was a formation designed to stop cavalry, and for a moment it worked. English knights charged and broke against the Scottish spears. The field was chaos mud, blood, and the screams of dying horses. Arrows darkened the sky. But Edward had learned. He ordered his longbowmen forward. From the ridge above, waves of English arrows rained down upon the trapped Scots. The schiltrons faltered. Men fell where they stood. Then came the cavalry again, and this time the circle broke. By sunset, the battlefield was a graveyard. Thousands of Scots lay dead. Wallace's army was shattered. Yet he lived, bloodied, unbroken. He withdrew into the forests with the survivors. He had lost the battle, but not his resolve. In the chronicles, it said that Wallace refused to submit even then. "I have bled," he said, "but I have not bowed." Falkirk was more than a defeat. It was a fracture. The nobles blamed Wallace. They accused him of pride, of rashness, of ambition. Stripped of his title as guardian, he vanished into the hills, a fugitive once more, hunted by both England and his own countrymen. But Edward's victory, though complete on the field, was hollow. He had broken Wallace's army, not Scotland's spirit. For even in defeat, the name William Wallace lingered like thunder after a storm, distant, echoing, and impossible to silence. As the fires of Falkirk burned low, the hammer of the Scots might have believed he had won. But history, as it often does, was already whispering a different story. After Falkirk, the dream of Scottish freedom staggered under the weight of defeat. The fields were silent now, no songs of victory, no banners in the wind. Only the dead remained to testify to what had been lost. William Wallace, the man who had once commanded thousands, now walked alone. His body bore the scars of battle, his spirit bore the heavier wounds of betrayal. The nobility, those same lords who had once hailed him as guardian of Scotland, now turned their backs. They needed someone to blame for their shattered armies and burned fields. Wallace, the commoner, the outsider, was the perfect scapegoat. They called him reckless, accused him of pride of leading Scotland into ruin. Some whispered that he had overreached, that his victories had made him arrogant. Others, quietly, feared him still, for the people's love is a dangerous kind of power. By 1299, Wallace had resigned as guardian. His command was gone, his allies divided, his nation fractured. Scotland, once again, began to crumble beneath its own rivalries. Nobles bargained with Edward for lands and titles. Armies disbanded. The fire that had once burned so bright began to flicker in the cold winds of politics. But Wallace was not done. Though stripped of title and army, he refused to surrender. He vanished into the wilderness, into glens, mountains, and forests that had long hidden rebels and saints alike. For a time, he became a ghost. English patrols scoured the highlands, hunting him like an animal. Edward placed a price upon his head, dead or alive. Yet, somehow, he slipped through their grasp again and again. He fought small skirmishes, ambushed convoys, inspired whispers in taverns and villages. The legend lived on, though the man was weary and hunted. He knew his war could no longer be won with swords alone, so he sought allies abroad. In 1299 or 1300, Wallace is believed to have sailed to France, seeking support from King Philip IV, hoping that the French crown, ever wary of Edward's growing might aid Scotland's cause. But diplomacy, unlike battle, is fought with patience and pride. Wallace found himself entangled in the slow machinery of royal politics. To the courts of Europe, he was both hero and inconvenience, admired for his defiance, but dangerous to embrace. Still, he would not bow. Letters sent on behalf of the Kingdom of Scotland bore his name, a sign that, even in exile, Wallace claimed to speak for a nation that refused to die. Yet back home, Scotland was changing. New leaders rose, Robert Bruce among them, each driven by ambition as much as conviction. The cause of freedom fractured into rival claims. Wallace's absence became a wound, and in that wound, England worked its poison. By 1304, Edward's campaign had nearly pacified the north. Castle by castle, the resistance fell. The Scottish lords submitted. Even Bruce, for a time, bent the knee. Only one man remained unyielding, the outlaw, the ghost, the name the English could not erase. William Wallace. The last man still at war. But war without allies is death wearing a familiar face. And soon, Wallace would discover that the blade most fatal is not the one wielded by an enemy, but by a friend. By 1304, the rebellion was dying. The castles that had once flown the saltire now bore the Red Cross of England. Scottish nobles' men who had once marched beside Wallace swore new oaths to King Edward, trading their loyalty for safety, their honour for survival. The land was weary, its villages hollowed by war, its people crushed by hunger and tax. And somewhere within that broken landscape, William Wallace still lived. He had become a phantom, a whisper in the glens, a shadow moving through forests and ruins. The English called him the Wolf of the North. They said he could appear and vanish like smoke. There were nights when riders swore they heard his voice in the wind, rallying men who no longer dared to fight. For Edward, it was an insult that gnawed at him like a wound, this single man who refused to die, whose defiance mocked the crown itself. So began the long hunt. Edward unleashed his sheriffs and spies, his bounty hunters and informers. A vast network stretched across Scotland, paying in gold and blood for information. Wallace's name became a curse to speak, and yet it lingered everywhere, carved into tavern walls, whispered by mothers to frightened children as both warning and prayer. To the English, he was an outlaw. To the Scots, he was a ghost of freedom, proof that not all had surrendered. But ghosts cannot live forever. In the years after Falkirk, Wallace moved from one hiding place to another. He found refuge among a few loyal followers, men who had lost everything but honour. They raided English supply lines, struck at isolated garrisons, and melted back into the wilderness. It was a hopeless war, fought not for victory, but for remembrance. Every act of resistance was a message. Scotland is not yet broken. Yet isolation took its toll. The years had hardened him, stripped away everything but resolve. Friends were captured, executed, or vanished. Supplies dwindled. He could trust no one completely. Even in his homeland, betrayal was never far away, and Edward's gold could buy loyalty faster than any sword could win it. In the spring of 1305, the walls began to close in. Wallace's movements had become predictable, his allies fewer. Among those who once called him brother, envy and fear stirred. One of them, Sir John de Menteith, governor of Dumbarton Castle, would soon become the name history remembers with a hiss. It said Menteith invited Wallace under the guise of safe passage, promising rest and aid. Wallace came, perhaps believing that even now some honour remained among Scots. But that night, as he slept, his betrayer struck. Menteith's men seized him, bound him in chains, and delivered him to the English authorities at Glasgow. For 30 pieces of silver and a promise of pardon, Scotland's greatest son was handed over to his enemies. When news of the capture reached King Edward, the old monarch reportedly smiled for the first time in months. His quarry, the Phantom of Rebellion, was finally in chains. The order was immediate and merciless. Wallace was to be taken to London alive. And so began the final journey. Through towns and villages, jeering crowds watched as he was dragged south, a caged symbol of defiance. To some, he was a warning. To others, a saint. But to the man himself, there was no illusion. He had fought for a dream greater than himself, and that dream now lay in the hands of those too frightened to carry it on. The wolf of the north had been hunted down, but the flame he carried that could not be chained. There are betrayals that alter wars, and betrayals that alter nations. The capture of William Wallace was both. In August 1305, the man who had once stood undefeated at Stirling Bridge was delivered in chains to his enemies. The betrayal came not from an English sword, but from a Scottish hand, that of Sir John de Menteith, a noble sworn to Edward's service, who had once called Wallace ally. It was treachery born not merely of gold or fear, but of ambition. For in an age where survival meant submission, loyalty was a luxury few could afford. The details of the betrayal remain clouded in history, wrapped in the shame of its telling. Some say Menteith invited Wallace to Glasgow under a flag of truce, promising food and safety. Others claim Wallace was ambushed as he slept in the company of his dwindling band of followers. However it happened, when the dawn broke, Scotland's greatest freedom fighter was no longer free. Bound in iron chains, Wallace was taken first to Dumbarton Castle, a stone fortress perched over the River Clyde, where he was held under heavy guard. From there, he was handed to the English Justiciar of Scotland, Sir Aymer de Valence, and ordered to London under royal command. His journey south was slow and deliberate, a living symbol of English triumph. Through towns and villages, the people gathered to see him. Some spat, others stared in silence. Children were lifted onto shoulders to glimpse the man their fathers had cursed or praised. His captors made sure the spectacle was not lost. Wallace was paraded in rags, his wrists bound, his hair matted. Yet his eyes, witnesses said, still burned with something terrible and unyielding. Even the English chroniclers noted it. He bore himself, one wrote, as if his spirit could not be chained, though his flesh was captive. For King Edward, Wallace's capture was more than victory, it was vindication. The rebellion that had humiliated his armies and tarnished his reign would now end in public submission. The king ordered that Wallace be brought not quietly, but through the heart of London, so that every man and woman might see what becomes of those who defy the English crown. On the morning of the 22nd of August 1305, Wallace's cart entered the city gates. The streets were lined with thousands. Bells rang. Banners hung from windows. The prisoner was dragged through the mud, tied to the tail of a horse, the first stage of a punishment reserved for traitors. Yet the irony was cruel. Wallace had never sworn allegiance to Edward, and so, by law, could not be a traitor. But law mattered little when vengeance ruled the day. As he passed through Cheapside, past Street Paul's, and toward Westminster, the people saw not a broken man, but a warrior stripped of everything except dignity. He did not plead, did not curse, did not look away. The chroniclers tell us his silence was haunting it, unsettled the crowd more than any words could have. When he was finally thrown into his cell in the Tower of London, the rebellion seemed truly over. Scotland lay under English rule, its nobles bowed, its castles surrendered, its armies gone. The lion had been caged, and Edward could finally rest. But legends are stubborn things. Even caged lions dream of open fields. In that cold stone cell, as the city slept, Wallace awaited the dawn that would bring his trial, a trial already decided before it began. And though he could not know it, his death would do what his sword no longer could. Awaken a nation. Dawn broke grey and cold over London on August 23rd, 1305. From the tower, the sound of iron hinges echoed down the corridors as guards prepared their prisoner. William Wallace, once guardian of Scotland, now branded traitor and outlaw, was dragged from his cell and led toward Westminster Hall for trial. But trial was a word without meaning here. The verdict had been written long before the man was brought to the stand. Westminster Hall, vast and echoing, was filled that morning with the murmur of nobles, clerics, and courtiers, all summoned to witness the final humiliation of England's greatest enemy. At the far end of the hall, beneath the banners of the crown, sat the king's judges. The charge was read aloud, each word dripping with venom. Treason, murder, sacrilege, rebellion against the rightful king, Edward of England. The accusations were formal, the spectacle theatrical. Wallace had no counsel, no advocate, no chance. His chains clinked as he stood before them, unbowed. When asked for his plea, he spoke for the first time, his voice rough, quiet, but steady enough to still the hall. "I am no traitor," he said. "I could not be, for I have never sworn allegiance to Edward of England. I fought for my own country's freedom." The simplicity of his words cut sharper than any weapon. For a heartbeat, even his enemies hesitated. They had expected rage or begging, not calm truth. But defiance had always been Wallace's weapon. And here, in the court of his conquerors, he wielded it one last time. The judges scowled, unmoved. The charges were repeated, louder this time, as if sound could drown truth. They accused him of the slaughter of English soldiers, of desecrating churches, of waging war against divine authority. But Wallace stood silent again, eyes fixed forward. The farce continued until the presiding justice, unable to bear the silence, struck the table and declared him guilty. The sentence was read with cold precision. He was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the most brutal punishment English law could devise, to die as a warning to all who dared defy the crown. Yet, even in that moment, he did not flinch. Eyewitnesses wrote that Wallace showed neither fear nor remorse. One chronicler, bitterly English yet unwilling to deny what he saw, described him as undaunted and fierce, his gaze unbroken. He asked for no mercy, he offered no apology. And as the guards seized him, as the hall roared with the king's justice, Wallace's defiance grew into something larger than himself. The English thought they were silencing a rebel, but in truth, they were crowning a martyr. Outside, London waited. The scaffold had been prepared. The crowds were already gathering, drawn by curiosity, hatred, or grim fascination. But inside that hall, something irreversible had already happened. For every word spoken against him, history would remember his single reply. "I fought for my country's freedom." Not, "I fought against England." Not, "I fought for vengeance." But freedom, a word that outlives kings, courts, and empires. By the time the guards dragged him away, William Wallace had already won the only victory that mattered. He had taken from Edward the one thing no conqueror can command the last word. The morning air hung thick with anticipation. London had seen executions before, thieves, murderers, rebels, but never one like this. From every alley and market, crowds poured towards Smithfield, where a wooden scaffold had been raised overnight. Soldiers lined the streets, bells tolled. The city, vast and restless, waited for the spectacle that King Edward had promised. The death of William Wallace, the so-called Butcher of England. At mid-morning, the gates of the tower opened. A cart emerged, and upon it chained, pale but upright, stood Wallace. His hands were bound, his body gaunt from captivity, yet his bearing remained defiant. Witnesses said he looked neither right nor left, only forward, eyes fixed as though already beyond the reach of men. The jeering began as the procession wound through the streets. "Traitor!" some cried, others spat, yet among them others stood silent, compelled not by hate but by awe. They had come expecting a monster. What they saw was something altogether different, a man unbroken by the machinery of empire. He was dragged by horse through the filth of the city, the first stage of England's most brutal punishment to be drawn for treason. The crowd followed, roaring, but his silence was louder than their noise. No plea, no curse, no cry, only the rattle of chains and the steady rhythm of hooves. When they reached Smithfield, the air itself seemed to pause. The scaffold loomed tall, stark, and crowned with the instruments of execution. Wallace was hauled upward and forced to kneel. The executioner read the sentence once more: to be hanged until near death, then cut down, disemboweled, and quartered, his limbs sent to the corners of the realm as warning to all who rebel. And yet, as the rope was placed around his neck, he looked toward the crowd, not down, not away. Some claimed he whispered a prayer, others swore he smiled. The rope tightened, the platform dropped, his body convulsed, suspended between life and death. The crowd gasped, some cheering, others turning away. But before death could claim him, he was cut down, gasping, still alive. The executioner went about his task with mechanical precision, as ordered by the king. What followed was too brutal for words, but every act of cruelty only deepened the silence that had fallen over the crowd. Even those who had come thirsting for blood found no satisfaction. The spectacle had turned to horror. When it was over, the remains of William Wallace were divided. His head dipped in tar and set upon London Bridge, his limbs sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. The message was clear: this is what becomes of those who dream of freedom. But messages have a way of being misunderstood, because the image that lingered in those who watched was not one of defeat, but of defiance. Wallace had faced the full might of an empire and yielded nothing. His death, meant to silence a rebellion, instead gave it voice. Within a few short years, Scotland would rise again under Robert the Bruce. At Bannockburn, in 1314, the Scots would finally break Edward's grip, and, among the men who charged that day, many carried Wallace's name upon their lips. The king had destroyed the body, but the idea, the fire he lit, lived on, burning beneath every banner of independence, every whisper of rebellion that followed. On that scaffold at Smithfield, William Wallace died. But freedom, his freedom, did not. In the days after the execution, London went on with its life. Markets reopened, bells rang for mass, and merchants crossed London Bridge under the shadow of a tarred head mounted on a spike. Few looked up. Fewer still dared to speak the name. But some did, quietly, reverently. They said that when the wind blew from the north, the head of William Wallace seemed to turn toward Scotland, as if the spirit within refused to rest. And, in Scotland itself, his death was not the end, it was ignition. News of his execution spread across the highlands and lowlands, carried by travellers and priests, by whispers in cottages and castles. The English believed they had destroyed the symbol of rebellion. Instead, they had created a martyr. Because martyrs do not die, they multiply. In the years that followed, Edward I would chase his ghosts across Scotland, burning villages, hanging rebels, building castles to cement his conquest. But his triumph was temporary. Less than a decade later, Robert the Bruce would rise, uniting a fractured land beneath one purpose. At Bannockburn in 1314, Scotland would strike back and win. And though Wallace was long dead, his name rode with them that day. Soldiers prayed to him, shouted his name as they charged, and believed that his spirit guided their swords. History has a strange way of balancing the scales. The man whom England sought to erase became the soul of a nation. And as centuries passed, Wallace transformed from outlaw to legend, from legend to symbol. His story was told not only in chronicles, but in songs and poems, in fireside tales whispered to children. To some, he was the avenging knight, larger than life. To others, the common man who dared to rise against tyranny. But at the heart of every version was the same unshakable truth. William Wallace fought and died for the right of a people to call their land their own. In Stirling today, his monument still stands, tall above the valley where he won his greatest victory. Visitors climb the long spiral staircase to gaze out across the same landscape he once fought for a view of rivers, hills, and fields that have seen both blood and freedom. And at the top, etched in stone, are words simple yet eternal. Freedom is best. Perhaps that is the truest measure of his legacy, not in the battles he fought, but in the idea he left behind. An idea that no sword could kill, no empire could silence. Because what Wallace understood, what every tyrant forgets, is that freedom is not granted by kings, it is claimed by those who will not kneel. More than 7 centuries have passed since that day at Smithfield. The world has changed beyond measure, but the story still endures. It endures because it speaks to something timeless, the defiance of the powerless, the courage to stand alone, the belief that even in death, truth outlives the conqueror. The English crown sought to make William Wallace an example, and they did, but not in the way they intended. His body was torn apart, his country nearly conquered, yet his spirit became immortal, not in blood, but in memory. So when we speak his name, it is not with sorrow, but with recognition, that somewhere, in every age, in every nation, there walks another soul who will not bow another heart that beats to the same rhythm of defiance and faith. And if you listen closely, across time and wind and history's long silence, you can still hear it, that whisper of chains breaking, that echo of a voice refusing to yield. The voice of William Wallace, the cry of freedom.
If this story moved you, if it reminded you that courage can outlast empires, then share it. Subscribe for more untold histories of those who dared to stand when others bowed. Because the story of freedom is never truly over.